Everybody doing okay? We are on week number 12. This is the second to last week. Can you believe that? That is flying by, I know. If you weren't here last week, we talked about these suggested intermediates. We've already mentioned before multiple times that if the Darwinian idea of evolution were true, there should be millions or billions or trillions of intermediate transitional fossils in the fossil record. They're not there. There's only a handful that secular scientists are willing to argue over, and those are the ones we looked at last week. And overall, pretty much every single one of those is either an invented intermediate based on fragmentary fossil evidence and an evolutionary interpretation, or a false arrangement of those fossils based on the idea that evolution is true. Circular reasoning, as we talked about last week. But we still see it proclaimed as absolute truth in our school systems. Again, trying to push across that idea, that worldview that says we don't need God to explain anything. We can explain our history, where we came from, our origins. We can explain everything without God. That's the idea of secular humanism. Thus, the idea of public education and indoctrination. And it's not just in our schools. It's in our culture at large. All you need to do is turn on the TV and you'll see it. Of course, in every different, whether it's the news or just syndicated shows or whatever, you see it everywhere. But it's in the public arena as well. There was a billboard program started by atheists over in Europe first, and they got these on buses, on signs all around the place. But signs like this that says, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." And as is usually the case, it kind of moved from Europe to America. And now we see these signs popping up all over the United States of America. Signs like this in Cincinnati: "Don't believe in God? Not alone." Chicago: "Are you good without God? Millions are." Again, the same type of sign in Cleveland, Columbus, Dallas-Fort Worth, Iowa, same type deal. Here's a sign in Indiana. It goes from Iowa all the way down to Florida. Here's a sign in Indiana. Started on 25 buses in Chicago. Now, in Indiana, it says, "In the beginning, man created God." And you can be good without God. How about this one in Seattle? "Yes, Virginia, there is no God." And then this one in New York City. "You know it's a myth. This season, celebrate reason." And there's definitely an attack in our culture on the Christian worldview. And so we need to be ready to give an answer for the faith that we have in all categories, including our origins, which is what we have been doing. Tonight, we're going to look at all the other evidences presented as basically evidence in the textbook for evolution. They're a lot of times called the icons of evolution because they've been presented for many, many years now. These are some of the odds and ends that you may not be as familiar with. We're all kind of familiar with the idea of the ape men and transitional fossils and so forth. But these are some of the other things you might remember, millions of years ago when you were in school, when you studied these things. Or you might not, but they're still in our textbooks today telling us that evolution is true, and by default, the Bible is wrong. So let's look at some of these. The first one is the idea of homologous structures, comparative anatomy. I'm just curious, does anybody remember talking about this in school? A few of you? Okay, well, it's definitely in the textbooks. Here's what it's basically suggesting: that the forelimbs, the forearms of vertebrates, contain similar kinds of bones. Therefore, we must have a common ancestor. So if you look in your forearm, we got the radius and the ulna, and the alligator, he's got a radius and ulna too. Well, look at that. We must be related. We must have a common ancestor. It's in pretty much every single textbook. They tell us comparative anatomy provides further evidence of evolution. The commonality suggests that these and other vertebrate animals are all related. They probably evolved from a common ancestor. And I can literally show you probably 40 slides that I have. I will not do it, but they all suggest that homologous structures, these common forelimbs of common bone structure in these forelimbs, suggest a common ancestor, one after another. Junior high textbooks, high school textbooks, college textbooks, it's everywhere. I would argue that maybe a common design in these things suggests a common designer. One God who made them all to live in the same world, in the same universe, and operate in the same laws of nature, which would make sense. The Bible tells us God made all these things. What's intriguing about these different bones and these different organisms, if you actually map out how they develop, the bones of different organisms develop from different genes. If evolution was true, you would not expect that to be so. You'd expect them to develop from the same genes. Not only that, but they usually go along different developmental lines. And again, if we all come from a common ancestor, we should see some type of trend where these things follow the same path of development within the chromosomes. They do not. They appear to be random, which is a big strike against the idea of a common ancestor. Plus, if you think about it like this, you can take the lug nuts from a Pontiac and they'll fit on a Chevy. It's true. That proves they both evolved from a Honda 14 million years ago. No, right? But homologous structures, the thing we got to remember about them, and something we've said a lot of here lately, is that they exist in the present. And you have to interpret them based on your worldview. And so it's either they have a common ancestor or a common designer. Which one is it? Well, I would argue that since we don't see macroevolution in the present, since we don't see macroevolution in the fossil record, no intermediates, and since we don't see a mechanism for adding new genetic information like you would need for macroevolution, I think the common designer is a better argument. Plus, you have another issue that we really haven't touched on because it's such a broad field, and it is fascinating. The idea of complexity in living organisms. And so I want to touch on a little bit of that just for a second. Let me talk about the eye. Now, of course, the Bible tells us that God made the eye, which that makes sense. And do you realize that the eye, literally just in less than a square inch, there are 137 million electrical connections? How would you like to be the guy who hooks that up? That's pretty intense. It has been said that the eye, it would take 100 years of Cray computer time, which is the old supercomputer, but still, 100 years of Cray computer time to simulate what the eye does many times every second. That's how advanced and complex our eyes are. Charles Darwin actually said, to suppose that the eye could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. Then he goes on for a few pages to try to explain how he thinks it happened. But the deal is, in order to get an eye to evolve from a non-eye, what good is a half eye? It doesn't work unless all the parts are there. This textbook tells us that the human eye may be the product of millions of years of evolution. And I love their proof and explanation. Check this out. It says you can better understand how the eye might have evolved if you picture a series of changes during the evolution of the eye. It happened, just picture it. Why do you have to picture it? We don't see any evidence for it in the present nor in the fossil record. It only takes place in the imagination. But we know it had to evolve. Why? Because we needed to see, and the eye is an adaptation to seeing. You get the same type of argument with gills. This textbook tells us that gills are an adaptation to living in water, which I agree, you need gills to live in water. But here's my question. How did the critters live in the water before they adapted the gills? Well, you see, they didn't. They all died. Which would explain why evolution takes so long, right? You know you're going to get them. You come, you know it's going to happen. This is introducing an idea called irreducible complexity. And this is an idea that was really introduced by Michael Behe. The intelligent design movement's really big on this, and there are some good things about the intelligent design, although it's not necessarily Christian because they don't try to identify the designer, which leads to problems. We can talk more about that later if you want. But Michael Behe, not a Christian as far as I know, wrote this book called Darwin's Black Box. Great book where he really expounds upon this principle. Here's the principle. Irreducible complexity, a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of these parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. How many of you have a car? How many of you have ever had a car die on you or not work? Yeah. How many parts in a car have to be working for it to run? All of them, right? Pretty much thousands upon thousands of different parts. How many parts have to not be working for the car to not run? All it takes is one, right? That's the idea of irreducible complexity, a mechanism. And by the way, living organisms are basically machinery to a degree we can't even fathom. But they are like machines, but it's such a high degree of complexity above what we can imagine. So machines need all our parts in complete working order to function. Same thing with living organisms. And to really expound upon this idea of complexity, I want to show you this clip from Expelled, where they're talking about the complexity of the cell. Now remember, macroevolution suggests that this cell came together by random chance. I want you to watch this.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Darwin wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, published it in 1859. He had an idea of the cell as being quite simple, correct?
Yeah, everybody did.
Okay. If he thought of the cell as being a Buick, what is the cell now in terms of its complexity by comparison?
A galaxy.
A galaxy.
A galaxy.
What do we now know that a cell is? If it's not a lump of jello, what would you compare it to?
It's a nano factory.
If Darwin thought a cell was, say, a mud hut, what do we now know that a cell is?
I would say it would be more complicated than a Saturn V.
So what is in a cell as far as we know now?
A world that Darwin never could have imagined.
The cell may be the most dynamic. It is one mass of activity going on, bringing information out from across the cell, opening doors, closing doors, motor molecules moving along tracks. It is probably one of the most dynamic physical systems in the universe.
We've got this whole automated city. Everything is automated, and it's a level of nanotechnology which would cause any engineer to drool.
It's Broadway without the traffic lights.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? And think about this, that from conception until birth, the baby produces 15,000 cells per minute. How would you like to be in charge of that manufacturing line? All right? And each one's going to be more complex than a space shuttle. Absolutely amazing. But back to the eye for a second. Some have argued that the eye is poorly designed, and therefore that's evidence for evolution. And they argue this because we have blood vessels in front of our retina. And so they say, you see, the eye is wired backwards. If the blood vessels were behind the retina, we could see much better, much like the octopus. But you can switch eyes with an octopus if you want to. Go right ahead, but in about 3 or 4 days, you're going to be blind. Because you see, we live in the air. And air is a really poor insulator for UV light. So we have the blood vessels in front of our retina to protect our eyes from UV light. Octopus live in the water. Water is a much better insulator for UV light. They don't need the blood vessels in front of their retinas. So octopus are designed to live in the water, and we are designed to live in the air. Pretty exciting, right? Which is what you would expect. And the argument is basically saying this, and you see this kind of repeated theme in many different aspects. God wouldn't do it that way, so it must have evolved. Which, of course, is a bad argument for evolution. Not to mention, once you start doing that, you're arguing philosophy or religion as opposed to science. Because you're talking about what God would or would not do, which is a religious argument. You have the same thing with homologous structures. Many scientists will say, well, certainly, God would not make so many living organisms with the same 4-limb structure. I don't think God would do that. Well, when you make that argument, you're making a religious or philosophical argument, not scientific. So, some conclusions about the homologous structures. Number one, many animals contain a 4-limb structure. That's true. That's a very good observation. Therefore, that means they must have a common ancestor. I think that's a bad conclusion. And then if you take it to the next step, this helps prove we all came from a rock. You've got a really bad conclusion, all right? Which is what the general idea of macroevolution suggests. Moving on, though, next, the textbook will tell us, but we have evidence from development for evolution. And again, when they say evolution, they're implying macro, the whole thing. This is called comparative embryology. It suggests that since organisms develop similarly in the womb or so forth, that they have a common ancestor. As a matter of fact, here's what the textbook tells us. The similarity between early stages in the development of many different animals helped convince Darwin that all forms of life shared a common ancestor. As a matter of fact, Darwin considered this by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of his theory. The guy who came up with this idea, his name was Ernest Haeckel, and he called it the biogenetic law, which sounds really official. And this is what I mentioned last week. This is the idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And basically what that means is ontogeny, the development of the embryo, recapitulates, that is the reenactment of phylogeny, that is the history of evolution. So as the embryo develops, it goes through its old evolutionary history, showing us how things evolved. That's the general argument. And this you can find in pretty much every single textbook as well that talks about biological life. This textbook tells us it is the embryo that retains a memory of its origin and evolution. And the presence of fish-like structures in embryos shows that they came from fish and we have a common ancestor. What basically happened is Ernest Haeckel, who was an embryologist, read Darwin's book in 1860. And he thought, man, what a fantastic theory, if only Darwin had some evidence. And he thought, no, I can help him out. So he made some drawings of some embryos. And he made the drawings look very, very similar between at least 8 to 24 different critters. And he made them look so similar, they look nothing like the actual embryos. He faked his drawings. Here are his drawings up above. Here are the actual embryos. Not only that, but he skipped the first stage of embryological development and went right to the middle because they look more alike. So basically, it is one of the worst cases of scientific fraud ever, as mentioned by this secular scientist. He says it was deliberately misleading and it makes him angry. It makes me angry too. And although Haeckel confessed and was convicted of fraud in 1875, the drawings still persist in our textbooks. Now, I know it takes some time to kind of get your textbooks up to date, but I think 140 years is plenty, you know. But in order to kind of summarize this and also give you a picture of the public education indoctrination, I'm going to show you a little bit of a lengthy clip from a movie called Icons of Evolution. And they're going to focus on Haeckel's drawings and also focus on the idea of how a certain teacher here is being limited to just the textbook information. This teacher, presented in this video, was not teaching creation. He wasn't teaching the Bible. All he was doing was presenting scientific evidence from other secular scientists that showed problems with the theory of evolution. But because he was doing that, the school censored him because some of the people in the public got upset. So it's going to pick up where it's talking about how this particular teacher is being censored and what he can and cannot teach based on the idea of evolution. Here you go.
According to DeHart, his principal rejected all his requests, and he was forbidden from using any outside materials that might be critical of evolution.
They went from not allowing me to introduce any supplemental materials, then to telling me that I could not verbally share any of this information with my students.
The fact of the matter is, every other teacher in Burlington's school district was allowed to assign supplementary materials whenever they want. But when Roger DeHart decided to assign a few articles from mainstream science journals, they censored him.
One article Roger DeHart wanted to show students was from the American Biology Teacher, the leading peer-reviewed journal for secondary school biology teachers. It was written by Jonathan Wells, a biologist with a PhD in molecular and cell biology from the University of California at Berkeley. Wells is one of a growing number of scientists raising objections to Darwin's theory. In his article, Wells points out how many textbooks continue to use fraudulent drawings of embryos made by 19th century German Darwinist Ernst Haeckel.
Ernst Haeckel was a German biologist and artist, a contemporary of Darwin's, who, among other things, made some famous drawings of vertebrate embryos, fish, humans, salamanders, chicks, turtles, and so on. And in those drawings, Haeckel tried to show that all these different vertebrates look very much the same as early embryos. Their early similarities showed that they came from a common ancestor, and differences arose only later. The problem is that he faked his drawings. The early vertebrate embryos don't really look that similar at all.
The problem with Haeckel's drawings wasn't just that they were inaccurate, they were actually false in many cases. But the real damage was done when these drawings entered into biology textbooks decades ago, and they've never really been taken out. If you open a high school biology text now, or even a college biology text, you'll find these drawings, although they may not refer to them as Haeckel's drawings, and in fact, they trace their ancestry directly to Haeckel.
You see the pictures of the embryos.
And it's really damaged our understanding of development and our understanding of biology in general.
It's clear that Haeckel may have fudged his drawings somewhat to look more like his ideal than they actually are. Now, does that actually take away from what we know about the relationship of embryology to evolution? Not a bit. The whole Haeckel's embryo story has been greatly blown out of significance. It is a minor footnote in the history of science, and actually it's been known for 10 or 15 years that Haeckel's embryos are not to be relied upon. The reason why the diagrams are reproduced is because they're easily available. There's no copyright on them. It's an easy way to illustrate a point. And I would argue that the basic point that's being illustrated by those drawings is still accurate.
But if you go back earlier in development, the different classes of vertebrates look even more different.
According to Wells, Haeckel, in many modern textbooks, misleads students not just because of fake drawings, but because they leave out the earliest stages of embryonic development. What students are shown as the first stage of embryonic development is actually the mid-stage.
And very few textbooks show those earliest stages, and yet that's the whole point. It's the earliest stages that are supposed to be the most similar, and they're not. Some textbooks actually use photographs of embryos, but they pick only that stage and those classes that happen to look most similar. And they omit the earlier stages, and they omit those classes that don't look similar. So that, to me, is picking the evidence very carefully to support the theory, and that's not good science.
Wells is a critic of Darwin's theory, but even staunch evolutionists like Harvard's Stephen Jay Gould have criticized the use of diagrams based on Haeckel in textbooks.
Stephen Jay Gould wrote an article for Natural History saying that we need to let go of these drawings, that basically that they're not needed.
But when DeHart requested permission to let students read Gould's article, that request was turned down too.
Why does Mr. DeHart feel so strongly to have these articles read? Well, it's because he wants to call into question the whole issue of whether evolution happened. I don't think this is good science education for the students in that district.
Wow. So it's not only that, and you got out the whole issue, but also if you look at the embryological development, the textbooks will tell you that these embryos, have a tail and gills like a fish, showing our common ancestry back to where we used to be animals, to monkeys, and of course to fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. Again, I can go through many textbooks. We have gill pouches, gill slits. We have tails, gill slits. You have it in your junior high books, gills, tails. We as humans have gills and tails. You can go through this in college textbooks, the science dictionary. It's about everywhere you can fathom. It's all over the place. Yet we know these so-called gill slits are not gill slits at all. They have nothing to do with breathing. They're just folds of tissue. And these folds of tissue have a superficial resemblance to gills, but they become bones in the ear and pieces of the throat. That is all they do. Not only that, this so-called tail and yolk sac, which is supposed to show some type of evolutionary connection, well, if you look at it, this yolk sac forms our first blood cells. It has nothing to do with quote-unquote yolk. And this tail is our coccyx, which is very important for multiple reasons, which we'll talk about later on. They know these things to be true, yet they are still in our textbooks. So what you have here is Darwin comes up with the origin of species in 1859. Haeckel faked his drawings in the late 1860s. They're shown to be false in 1875, and yet they are still in our textbooks. Absolutely amazing. And I would suggest that similar embryonic development would suggest a common designer. As we talked about with homologous structures, very similar argument. Let me put this forth. If you look at this textbook, it shows a picture of a 5-week-old embryo. And then it says by 7 months, it may look like a baby, but it's not. It's not a human being at 7 months. If it's not a human being, what type of being is it? Genesis 16, God talking to Sarah, behold, thou art with fetus? No. You're a child. And you realize that 34% of babies born at 5.5 months survive? Here's a picture of Samuel Alexander, 21 weeks old, had to do special surgery. Doctor had to cut open the womb, grabbed his finger. Baby made it alive. Pretty amazing picture. But the danger of accepting this idea of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny is it leads to the devaluing of human life. And for those who see abortion as a good thing, or maybe even a necessary thing, this becomes a compelling or even a strong argument if it goes through its evolutionary stages, if it's not really a human being. And just for a sobering reminder for us, we need to realize that there's a war on the unborn. Do you realize that all the wars we fought as a country, a little over 1 million people have died in all the wars as a country? Since the 70s, maybe late 60s, there have been 45 million people, U.S. citizens, killed by abortion. There's been about 1 billion worldwide. 1 billion. And think about this. On September 11th, 3,000 Americans died, and it was tragic and horrific, and nobody argues that. But do you realize on that same day, 4,500 other Americans died by abortionists? And the day before that, and the day after that, and the day after that. And I say that just to remind us, I know it's kind of a downer, but it should be. And it should sober us and remind us that we need to stand for truth and fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. Because as we go through the scriptures, I think it's very clear that God wants us to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. And that's just a reminder for that. But moving on to the next supposed evidence for evolution, DNA. And this is really going to be very similar to the homologous structures argument and the idea that we have a comparative embryology. DNA. The textbook tells us that molecular biology proves evolution. And if you look in the textbook, this is what it'll tell you. Darwin speculated that all forms of life are related through descent with modification. This speculation has been verified. So what is DNA? Before we actually look into the evidence, let's talk about what DNA is. And to do that, I want to let this video from Answers in Genesis quickly summarize DNA. Here you go.
If you found an ancient clay tablet with strange characters washed up on the shore, you couldn't read it, unless someone had cracked the code. But you'd still know the letters represented a language, even if you didn't know anything else about the author or his civilization. Language is recognizable, even if you can't read it. Take Morse code. It has 3 basic parts: dots, dashes, and spaces. These 3 simple parts are combined to represent letters. There are 26 letters in the English language, which are combined to form over 400,000 words. Those words can, of course, be combined into an infinite number of sequences or sentences. There is evidence that DNA represents a language. 4 basic units, called nucleotides, combine into a code for 20 amino acids. From those few amino acids, the body forms more than 100,000 proteins. Even if you can't read DNA, it still has all the hallmarks of language, a language that biologists are just now beginning to crack. Every tiny cell in our body is packed with 3 feet of DNA, 3 billion nucleotides. The similarity between DNA and human language is uncanny. In addition to codes, both use similar techniques to pack, access, rearrange, copy, and translate information. DNA seems to represent a language, the language of life. An unseen author, the creator of heaven and earth, has left a testimony of his existence in the DNA of every living thing.
All right, and don't forget, we mentioned this earlier, that when we talk about information, we know for a fact, it's called a law of information, that information always comes from a mind. Always comes from a mind. And we see that with DNA. Now, if you get into the details of DNA, it's just absolutely amazing. Of course, that video helps us out a little bit. It is the most complex molecule in the entire universe. Each body, each one of us, has over 100 trillion cells in our body. It's like a galaxy of cells inside of us. And the DNA in all those cells, if pulled out and extracted and put in a spoon, it would be 2 tablespoons. That's how compact it is. But then if you were to take that DNA and stretch it out, it would go from the earth to the moon, back again, over 500,000 times, which is just an amazing thought. You keep going. The code in the chromosomes is more complex than all computer programs ever written. Bill Gates said it's much more complex than anything we have designed. As a matter of fact, if you took out the DNA in your body, typed it out in the form of books, the books that would be typed out from the DNA for the instructions that makes you will fill the Grand Canyon 78 times. That's just the instructions to make you, which is just a fascinating thought. And so I have another video, and I know there's a lot of videos, but me and my wife were looking at them, and they were all so good, and I couldn't decide which one to pull out, so I'm just showing you all of them. Right, so here we are. This one is talking about DNA in particular, and it does such a fabulous job of showing the complexity of DNA. So I'll let you check this out.
With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary to build every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nuclear pore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
Isn't that amazing? I think the psalmist got it right when he said, "I'll praise thee, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made." It is amazing even now as we look at DNA, even though it's been sequenced, secular scientists will admit no direct access to the process of evolution can be seen. You can only imagine the idea of evolution because it's not seen in the DNA. There's no progressive change. Also, just an interesting side note almost, the mitochondrial DNA mutation rates suggest we have a common ancestor about 300 generations ago. You do 20 years of generation, that's about 6,000 years ago. Just something to think about. But if this is true, if evolution is true, it seems logical that the organisms with more chromosomes would be the more evolved organisms. So the ones with less would be less evolved. Based on this type of logic, we would assume maybe penicillin was the first thing to evolve because it has the least amount of chromosomes. And then you have the housefly and tomato. They're twins. They have the same amount of chromosomes, so you can definitely tell they look a lot alike. You keep moving on up, and then you get the possum, the redwood, and the kidney bean. They're triplets. Average scientists cannot tell them apart. Sorry. And of course, there we are at 46. And if we could just get two more, we could really be somewhere. And maybe one day we'll become a chicken or a dog. They're twins too. And if we keep evolving, we'll become a carp. And then somewhere, stardate 3000 AD, we'll become a fern. You know, if amphibians really did evolve before mammals, why do some amphibians have 5 times more DNA than mammals? And some amoeba have 1,000 times more. And I like this quote from Dr. Michael Denton to kind of summarize this point here. He is a biochemist. He is not a creationist. He's just a secular scientist who's very honest. He says this: The really significant finding that comes to the light when comparing proteins' amino acid sequences, the DNA, is that it is impossible to arrange them in any sort of evolutionary series. There is little doubt that if this molecular evidence had been available a century ago, the idea of organic evolution might never have been accepted. And of course, you may have heard about junk DNA. Scientists thought they found some junk DNA, maybe some leftover DNA from where we used to be something else, and now it's just hanging out doing nothing. So they took the junk DNA out, and it horribly mutated the mice. And they figured, maybe that stuff does do something. Come to find out, the quote-unquote junk DNA does have a function. As a matter of fact, it has multiple functions. It's polyfunctional. It's over 100% effective. And so there's definitely no junk DNA. But what about this? Scientists say we are so similar to the apes genetically, 96% close to the orangutan, and there's only 1.6% genetic difference between us and chimps, according to what they've mapped out so far. And you see this presented in pretty much every single textbook. Well, an important thing to realize about this is that, first of all, similar DNA codes probably suggest a common designer. And plus, if we are only 1.6% different from the apes, this may not sound like much, but if you actually calculate it out, that is a gap of at least 48 million nucleotides, and a change of only 3 nucleotides is fatal to an animal. So the change would be impossible. Not only that, but it appears as scientists do more and more research, this was 2002, they think we're only 95% identical to the chimps. And then 2004, maybe only 92.3%, and the number changes based on different observations. Plus, whether it's 2% or 7%, there are some obvious differences between us and chimps. That 2 to 7% is a big deal. Not only that, but how many of you knew that we are really closely related to kangaroos? Do you realize that we have about 90% genetic similarity to a kangaroo? 90%. How many of you heard that? Nobody. Why didn't you hear about this? They don't look like us. Not supposed to be on our evolutionary line. So you don't mention it. And they said, no, well, maybe we've got a common ancestor 150 million years ago. But if you think percentage of similarity proves some relationships, let me show you some of my other research I've been doing. Do you realize that we share half our genes with bananas? That could explain some of your family members. Right there, I'm just saying, that might be it. Clouds are 100% water. Watermelons are 97% water, so maybe they're related. Jellyfish, missing link, it's 98% water, right? Maybe the snow cone, that's what it is. No, the idea of similar structures, similar plans, just because stuff is similar doesn't mean it came together by chance or that tornadoes put it together. I like this quote from that gentleman right there. But look at these things right here. Just because things are made of the same stuff doesn't mean they have a common ancestor. Look at these creations. These are all Legos. Legos. That's Legos. That's Legos. That's a man with too much time on his hands. That is amazing. They did that with Legos. I'm pretty sure I saw this guy in a nightmare one time. That is a crazy looking bunny rabbit. Here is a whole family made out of Legos. All of these creations are made of the same building blocks, and they're vastly different. The fact they're made of the same stuff doesn't mean they arose spontaneously or they evolved from one to the other. They had a designer. And same with us. I have this quote from David DeWitt. He says, human designers frequently reuse the same elements and features, albeit with modifications. Since all living things share the same world, it should be expected that there will be similarities in DNA. We should expect that. So, summary of DNA, just really quickly. The fact that all organisms are made of the same stuff is great evidence for a common designer. And then the last thing we're going to talk about tonight, something we've hinted at already when we talked about well evolution, which is vestigial structures. And just in case you weren't here, the definition of vestigial structure is a body part that's become small and lost its use because of evolutionary change. And this is, again, something you'll see in pretty much every textbook. It says such structures are considered to be evidence for the organism's evolutionary past. So the idea is like the whale used to have legs, and as it evolved, it lost a purpose for legs, so it has those leftover little limbs for when it used to be legs. And that's supposed to be evidence for evolution. Two things. There probably are no vestigial structures. We'll get to that here in a second. And even if there were, that would be the opposite of evolution. Think about it. You're looking at something and say, that's what's left over. That's lost a function. It's going away. So how would that make evolution possible? You lose everything until you have it all? You're not showing a gain, you're showing a loss. It doesn't really help your case any. Let's go over some of the old things that evolutionists or secular science used to think were vestigial. We used to think the appendix was vestigial. Matter of fact, you can go to the University of Chicago website. Someone asked the scientist there, the professor, what is the function of the appendix? They said the appendix has no known function. It is believed that the appendix will gradually disappear in human beings as our diet do not include cellulose no more. Great place to get an education. Maybe not in English, but we do know that the appendix is not vestigial. It does have a function. It helps with our immune system, so it helps activate killer B cells, which we need. Not only that, if you don't have your appendix, you're more prone to get certain diseases. We know that for a fact. If you keep reading on the website, the professor says, well, but you can live without it. But just because you can live without it doesn't make it vestigial, doesn't make it useful. Look at this guy. No arms, no legs. Just because you can live without both your arms, both your legs, or both your eyes doesn't mean you don't need them. How many of you have seen this gentleman right here, Nick Volchacek? Probably butchered his last name. Absolutely amazing. This guy can preach and give the gospel. Just amazing. And I've seen him a few times. And it makes you feel guilty because he's doing so much with limited physical capabilities, but he is really out there for Christ. And again, you can live without certain things. Doesn't mean they're not needed. We already talked about the well, so I will kind of breeze through this. Those are indeed not leftover legs, as we talked about last week. But it's in the science dictionary. It's in your textbooks. It's even on National Geographic for kids. Hey, look, kids, hind legs for millions of years ago. And whales were walking around. It's true, remember. I still can imagine it, but there it is. And we did mention this, that this is not a pelvis of any sort. These quote-unquote leg bones, those little bones in the back, they have a known function. It's for reproduction. Whales don't have arms, and they usually mate in the dark. So you need special muscles attached to these special bones to help with the making of baby whales. This is known, by the way. And what evolutionists will argue is that, well, yes, but that's the new function, which is basically ignoring clear observations to fit your preconceived ideas. And you have the exact same argument with snakes. It says snakes also have vestigial hip bones or leg bones in the back, and they look actually very similar to the whales. You zoom in, there they are. These are supposedly vestigial legs. Rudimentary hind legs, and that's what they're talking about right there. Those little leg bones. Those are supposed to be what used to be legs. And again, almost exactly like the whale, these are claws. They're used during mating, just like with the whale, and have nothing to do with legs. And scientists know this, and they make the same argument. Well, it's a new function. Again, ignoring clear observations to fit their preconceived ideas. And so despite all this, despite what is known, despite what we just talked about, if your child watches National Geographic or PBS or Nova, he's going to see something like this clip I want to show you right here.
Basilosaurus has evolved a set of impressive tools for hunting. Exceptional eyesight. Improved underwater hearing. It evolves its long, thin body shape to hunt in shallow waters, and from its terrestrial past, it retains two useless remnants.
The most interesting thing about Basilosaurus is the retention of hind limbs with all the bones right down to the tips of the toes. So they are a vestige of a former life on land.
So to go and look at each one of these, what you would find is when you get that curve, it's really from a whole bunch of vertebrae bending, not so much a sharp bend in any one.
And yet, what you're not seeing is any sense of limbs here. So does this come first and then in evolutionary terms, and then limbs are somehow kind of attached for a different form of locomotion, or does it the other way around?
You've asked a really old question, and it's a really important question. So one of the things that we can show you is the evidence that these snakes are derived from lizards. And it's easiest to see these things in the male. And so I'm going to turn this over, and you'll see these structures on both sides. These are called spurs, and the males use them in reproduction and courtship. And what I'm doing here is just simply separating out the muscle from the body wall. Here, grab that with the forceps there. That's muscle.
Yeah.
And here we have.
Oh, you can see it.
Look at the bone coming out.
Yeah.
This is amazing.
There we go. That's the limb.
So this is the equivalent of pelvis.
That's the equivalent of pelvis.
That's the equivalent of the thigh bone or femur, and this part on the end is like a fingernail.
Probably. That would be a good
So
way to
it's,
describe
you
it.
skip right over leg.
So it's like
and foot.
it's like that.
Exactly.
That is amazing. Evidence of evolution. That is incredible.
This vestigial leg, now nothing more than a claw, is evidence that the ancestors of this creature once ran along on legs. Imagine you had an ancestor a bit like a lizard with a sort of lizard number of vertebrae, and then in evolution the vertebrae got duplicated and duplicated and duplicated again. It's like a great goods train and just putting in more and more trucks in the middle. They're nearly all thoracic vertebrae from the chest. They lost the front limbs and the hind limbs. And amazingly, there are vestiges of the hind limbs still there. It's a very telling example of a vestigial organ, something that was once there and was once larger and has now almost completely disappears, but betrays its history by being still there in a reduced, modified form.
And then the last vestigial structure we'll look at, just because it's close to home, is the coccyx. According to science, the human coccyx, we have a tail that is all that's left from a tail that we used to use. Oh yes, the human tailbone has no apparent use. The vestigial tailbone in humans, vestigial structures can be viewed as evidence for evolution. That's what our human tailbone is. This textbook tells us that we used to have a tail, but it went away because we don't use it anymore, or we don't need it. Don't need it. Have you ever thought about how handy a tail would be? I mean, that would be awesome. No, that's not. I was watching a debate one time between a creationist and an evolutionist, and the creationist, maybe a little bit too sarcastic, but he said to the gentleman, he said, you know what, if you think the coccyx is vestigial and useless, I will pay to have yours removed. Bend over. The guy chose to keep his coccyx because it is very important. As a matter of fact, if you're going to rate bones by their importance, by the amount of muscles that attach to them, the coccyx might win. It's absolutely amazing. It does multiple things. One, it has many functions I won't mention here. You can read your Gray's Anatomy about that if you want. But also forms a wall underneath it that holds your organs in, which is kind of important as well, amongst many other things. And people say, well, isn't that a tail? Well, that's just fatty tissue. It's kind of like a big wart. It happens with some kids sometimes. It has no bones, no muscle, no cartilage. It's not lined up with the spine. You just cut it off. Send the kid home. That's all it is. And despite all this, if you read your textbooks at the end, it'll say, at the end of your backbone is a coccyx, a few small bones that are fused together. Could the human coccyx be a vestigial structure, or is it the start of a newly evolving structure? That's critical thinking. What does that question assume? Evolution. It's more along the lines of indoctrination as opposed to education. And the same thing with this question. Do you think humans are still evolving? Same idea. These are like asking questions like this. Why are elephants orange? Why are they orange? Can you guys figure that out? Yeah, there's an assumption built in. And so as far as vestigial structures go, indeed over the years, nearly all the organs, once thought to be useless, have been found to have a function. It just takes us a little time to figure it out sometimes. God's a little smarter than us. And then I like this last quote. Since it is not possible to unambiguously identify useless structures, and since the structure of the argument is not scientific, it's actually circular, I conclude that vestigial structures provide no special evidence for the theory of evolution. So a quick summary of everything we just said. Homologous structures, comparative embryology, the commonality of DNA all suggest a common designer. And vestigial structures, if they exist at all, would still be a loss of information, not a gain. But yet this is what is put in your textbooks to convince your kids that evolution is right and the Bible is wrong. Next week, it is the last week. That's it. And we are going to end with this class. I'm really excited about doing it. It's brand new. It's called The Ultimate Proof of Creation, based on a book by Jason Lyle. And it deals with one of the questions I get asked most. What is the ultimate proof for creation? Is there one? And yes, there is. It's a little bit different way of thinking, but it's really, really cool. I challenge you to come out and really hear this out. The argument itself, there is no logical or rational comeback to what we'll talk about next week. And we'll talk about that then. All right, and one other point of business before we go, if you have your handouts from the last 12 weeks, you probably don't remember 3 months ago when I introduced this idea, we said we would bind those handouts together for you, especially if you wrote notes on them as you went and put them together, get a little binder on them so you can have like a little booklet to take with you from this. So if you still got your notes and you have, you got your sheets with your own notes written on them, bring those with you, we'll bind them together. If you want one and you don't have your note sheets or whatever, we'll just, we'll take some extras and put those together for you. But if you have your notes, be sure to bring those for next week. And if I can just ask for just a prayer from you guys, me and my wife, we are heading literally from here to Kentucky. And I'm giving a talk tomorrow at the Creation Museum to the guys down there. So if you can pray for just safe travel and for the talk itself, that would be a great thing, and we would really appreciate it. All right, let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, God, we thank you for this time together. God, I thank you for just the faithfulness of the people here to come and listen, and Lord, be really focused on finding out these answers, to have an answer to the questions that are asked in our culture, that they may glorify you. Not to build ourselves up, God, but that you may use us to answer questions, to draw people to yourself. Lord, I pray that as we leave, we will seek you with all our hearts, and that you will make your name known to the nations. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.